This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the winter of 1977, Cincinnati was a city caught between worlds. The industrial backbone that had defined it for generations was beginning to crack, sending ripples through working-class neighborhoods where families had counted on steady paychecks for decades. As factories downsized and traditional employment became uncertain, a new economy emerged in the shadows, one built on tips, late-night deliveries, and the promise that anyone willing to drive through snow-covered streets could make ends meet. Pizza delivery was no longer just a part-time job for high school students. It had become a lifeline for laid-off steelworkers, single mothers, and men in their 40s who found themselves competing with teenagers for routes through neighborhoods they'd lived in their entire lives. What began as friendly competition for the best delivery zones and highest tips slowly transformed into something darker, a silent war fought not with weapons, but with stolen routes, missing money, and the kind of grudges that fester in the fluorescent-lit backrooms of pizza shops across the city. This is the story of what happened when economic desperation met institutional indifference, when small betrayals compounded into something unthinkable. It's an investigation into the warning signs that everyone saw but no one acted upon, and the tragic chain of events that would forever change how a city viewed the simple act of ordering pizza to their door. The events depicted in this documentary took place over 18 months, culminating in a series of incidents that shocked Cincinnati and raised uncomfortable questions about the systems we trust to protect workers, mediate conflicts, and recognize when workplace tensions have crossed a line from which there is no return. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The snow was falling heavy on Vine Street when Tommy Castellano pulled his dented Chevy Nova into the parking lot behind Gino's Pizza Palace for the last time as an optimistic 22-year-old. It was January 15, 1977, and the city of Cincinnati was buried under 8 inches of fresh powder that made every delivery route a gamble between a decent tip and a busted transmission. Tommy didn't know it yet, but this shift would mark the beginning of what local newspapers would later call the Cincinnati Pizza War. Though by the time reporters started paying attention, it would be far too late to prevent what was coming. Gino's Pizza Palace sat on the corner of Vine and Macmillan, a narrow brick building wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing store that never seemed to close. The neon sign in the window buzzed and flickered, casting alternating red and white light across the slush-covered sidewalk. Inside, the familiar chaos of a Friday night dinner rush was already building, phones ringing constantly, ovens slamming shut, and the perpetual argument between kitchen staff and drivers about who was responsible for cold deliveries. Tommy had been working at Gino's for 8 months, long enough to learn that success as a delivery driver had nothing to do with how fast you could navigate Cincinnati's maze of one-way streets or how politely you smiled when customers answered the door in their bathrobes. It came down to 3 things: which neighborhoods you delivered to, which manager assigned your routes, and whether the other drivers considered you part of the inner circle or just another guy trying to steal their money. "Castellano, you're taking the university runs tonight," shouted Frank Kowalski from behind the dispatch counter, his voice cutting through the din of ringing phones and slamming oven doors. Frank was the night manager, a heavy-set man in his mid-30s who'd been running Gino's evening operations since the owner, Gino Marcelli, decided he'd rather spend his nights counting money in the back office than dealing with customer complaints about late deliveries. Tommy felt his stomach drop. University runs meant the student housing around the University of Cincinnati campus, 3-story apartment buildings packed with college kids who ordered pizza at 11 p.m. and tipped in loose change. Meanwhile, the good routes, the suburban houses in Clifton and Mount Adams where bank executives and lawyers lived, would go to Frank's favorites: Danny Morrison, who'd been at Gino's for 2 years and somehow always got assigned the big-money neighborhoods, and Rick Valdez, a quiet guy in his early 30s, who worked days at a factory and delivered pizzas 3 nights a week to supplement his income. "Come on, Frank, Tommy said, approaching the dispatch counter with what he hoped was a casual tone. "I took university runs 3 nights this week. What about giving me some of the Clifton deliveries tonight?" Frank didn't look up from his clipboard, where he was marking routes with a stubby pencil. "Danny and Rick handle Clifton. They know the area better than you do." "I've been working here 8 months. How much better do I need to know it?" This time Frank did look up, and Tommy could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment of whether this conversation was worth having or whether it would be easier to just shut it down. "Danny's got seniority, Castellano. That's how it works. You want better routes? Stick around longer." Tommy glanced across the narrow back room where Danny Morrison was folding pizza boxes with the kind of casual efficiency that came from doing the same motion thousands of times. Danny was 24, thin and angular, with the kind of confidence that made customers trust him immediately and managers rely on his judgment. He'd started at Gino's right after high school and had worked his way up to what amounted to unofficial assistant manager, though without the title or the pay raise that should have come with it. "How much longer?" Tommy asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "Because Rick's been here less time than me, and he gets Clifton runs." Frank's expression hardened. "Rick's got a family to feed. He needs the money more than you do." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. Tommy lived with 3 roommates in a cheap apartment near campus. No wife, no kids, no responsibilities, beyond his own rent and beer money. In Frank's calculation, that meant he could survive on university tips, while Rick, who had a wife and a 6-year-old daughter, deserved the $20 and $30 tips that came from delivering to the suburbs. Tommy wanted to point out that his own financial situation wasn't Frank's business, that needing money was needing money, regardless of whether you had dependents. But he also knew that arguing with Frank would only guarantee worse routes for the foreseeable future. So he nodded and picked up his delivery bag, the insulated red vinyl case that would be his constant companion for the next 8 hours. The first run was to a dormitory on Calhoun Street, 3 large pizzas for a group of students who answered the door already counting out exact change. No tip. The second delivery was to an off-campus apartment where 4 guys were pre-gaming for a basketball game, and they handed him $18 for a $17.50 order and told him to keep the change. 50 cents. By 9 p.m., Tommy had completed 6 deliveries and earned a total of $3.25 in tips. Meanwhile, Danny Morrison returned from his second Clifton run of the night and casually mentioned to Frank that Mrs. Henderson on Ludlow Avenue had tipped him $15 for a single pizza because he'd helped carry her groceries in from the car. Rick Valdez, who'd just finished a delivery to a house party in Mount Adams, was folding a $20 bill into his wallet. The disparity wasn't lost on anyone in the back room. Tony Ricci, a 19-year-old who'd started 2 weeks after Tommy, watched Danny count his money with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was doing calculations of his own. Angela Santos, the only female driver on the night shift, glanced up from her route sheet with the expression that mixed sympathy with resignation. Angela had been dealing with the route assignments longer than any of them. She'd started at Gino's 14 months ago, after her husband was laid off from his job at the General Electric plant in Evendale. At 28, she was older than most of the drivers and had developed a strategy for surviving the politics of pizza delivery. Work harder than everyone else, never complain about assignments, and save your real opinions for conversations that couldn't be overheard by management. "How'd you do tonight?" she asked Tommy quietly as they passed each other near the soda machine. "University runs," Tommy replied, and Angela nodded in understanding. "Frank's been giving those to all the new guys lately. Danny and Rick get the good stuff automatically." Tommy glanced around to make sure Frank was out of earshot. "Does it ever change? I mean, do you eventually get moved up to better routes?" Angela's expression suggested she'd been asked this question before. "I've been here over a year, still getting the worst neighborhoods half the time. Frank says it's about seniority, but really, it's about who he likes and who he thinks needs the money most." She paused, seeming to consider whether to say more. "And who complains and who doesn't." The implication was clear. Complaining about route assignments was a good way to ensure you'd never get better ones. But not complaining meant accepting whatever Frank decided you deserved, regardless of how long you'd been working or how well you knew the delivery areas. As the night progressed, the disparity in earnings became more pronounced. Danny finished his shift with over $60 in tips. Rick counted $48, enough to cover his daughter's daycare costs for the next week. Tommy ended the night with $11.80, barely enough to cover gas for his car. But money wasn't the only thing being distributed unequally at Gino's Pizza Palace. Information was currency too, and Frank controlled that flow just as carefully as he managed the route assignments. Danny always knew which neighborhoods were ordering large quantities, which customers were known for big tips, and which addresses to avoid because the residents were notorious for complaining about delivery times or finding excuses to reduce the bill. Tommy began to notice that Frank would quietly pull Danny aside for whispered conversations about special requests or last-minute orders from regular customers. Rick, despite having less seniority than Tommy, was often given similar advance warnings about potential problems or particularly profitable deliveries. Meanwhile, Tommy and the other newer drivers were sent out with minimal information, expected to figure out the unspoken rules through trial and error. The system created a hierarchy that had nothing to do with official job descriptions. Danny operated almost as a supervisor, making decisions about which deliveries could wait and which needed immediate attention. He had Frank's ear when problems arose and influence over how complaints were handled. Rick occupied a middle position, trusted with good routes, but not included in the deeper operational decisions. Everyone else was essentially interchangeable labor, competing for scraps of information and decent assignments. By the end of January, patterns had solidified that would define the next 18 months at Gino's Pizza Palace. Tommy, Tony Ricci, and two other newer drivers had been relegated to what amounted to a secondary tier of employment, working the same hours for significantly less money, with no clear path to advancement and no input into decisions that directly affected their earnings. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night in early February, when Tommy watched Danny return from a single delivery to a corporate office party in Hyde Park with $87 in tips. The order, 12 large pizzas, had taken Danny less than an hour to complete, including drive time. Tommy had spent the same hour making 4 separate deliveries to dormitories and student apartments, earning a total of $2.50. Standing in the back room of Gino's Pizza Palace, watching Danny fold 4 $20 bills into his wallet, while his own gas tank hovered near empty, Tommy Castellano made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. He decided that if the system wasn't going to be fair, he would find a way to make it fair himself. The Cincinnati Pizza War was about to begin, though it would be months before anyone realized they were fighting one. The first sign that something had shifted at Gino's Pizza Palace came on a Thursday night in late February, when Danny Morrison returned from what should have been a routine delivery to find his car tires slashed. Not just punctured, methodically cut with what appeared to be a box cutter, deep diagonal gashes that made the tires completely unrepairable. Danny stood in the alley behind the restaurant, staring at his disabled Honda Civic in the yellow glow of the security light, trying to understand how a night that had started normally had taken such a turn. "Jesus Christ," Frank Kowalski muttered when Danny called him outside. Who the hell would do something like this? It was a question that would hang over Gino's for the next several months, though the answer was probably simpler than anyone wanted to admit. Danny had been working at the restaurant for over 2 years, during which time he'd accumulated not just the best delivery routes and highest tips, but also a growing list of resentments from drivers who watched him walk away with $60 and $70 on nights when they struggled to make 20. Tommy Castellano was finishing his last delivery of the evening when he heard about Danny's car. The news traveled quickly through the small network of pizza drivers who worked the late shift in Cincinnati's University District. By the time Tommy returned to Gino's, a small crowd had gathered in the alley, drivers from neighboring pizza shops, a few customers who'd been waiting for their orders, and Angela Santos, who stood slightly apart from the group with an expression that suggested she was seeing something the others had missed. "Any idea who might have done this?" asked Mike Torres, a driver from Papa Joe's Pizza down the street. The question was directed at Danny, but his eyes were scanning the faces in the crowd, looking for tells that might indicate guilt or knowledge. Danny shook his head, though his own gaze lingered on Tommy for a moment longer than seemed casual. Could have been anybody. Lot of weird people in this neighborhood at night. The explanation felt insufficient to everyone present. Vine Street had its share of problems: petty theft, occasional fights outside the bars, the usual urban decay that came with being adjacent to a college campus, but random vandalism targeting specific individuals was rare. Slashing someone's tires required planning, patience, and a personal motivation that went beyond simple mischief. Frank called Danny a cab and told him to take the next 2 days off while he figured out insurance coverage for the damage. The gesture was typical of Frank's management style, generous enough to avoid immediate criticism, but calculated to maintain the loyalty of his most valuable employee. Everyone understood that if Tommy Castellano's tires had been slashed, he would have been told to find his own ride home and figure out his own transportation solutions. But the incident had consequences that extended beyond Danny's immediate inconvenience. For the first time since Tommy had started working at Gino's, he found himself assigned to several of Danny's regular routes in Clifton and Mount Adams. Frank presented this as a temporary necessity. Someone had to cover the deliveries, and Tommy knew those neighborhoods better than the newer drivers. But the effect was that Tommy got his first real taste of what Danny's typical night looked like. The difference was immediately apparent. Mrs. Peterson on Ludlow Avenue, a regular customer who ordered pizza every Friday night, handed Tommy a $20 bill for a $14 order and told him to keep the change. The Hendricks family in Mount Adams, celebrating their teenage son's birthday, tipped $15 on a $32 order and offered Tommy a slice of birthday cake. By the end of his first night covering Danny's routes, Tommy had earned more in tips than he typically made in 3 nights of university deliveries. More importantly, he began to understand the invisible infrastructure that supported Danny's success. These weren't random customers who happened to tip well. They were relationships that had been cultivated over months and years of consistent service. Danny knew that Mrs. Peterson preferred her pizza cut into small squares because she was elderly and had trouble with large slices. He remembered that the Hendricks family always ordered extra cheese, but wanted it light on the sauce. He'd learned that the law firm on Macmillan Avenue ordered pizza for their night shift twice a week, and that arriving 5 minutes early with extra napkins and plates would usually result in a tip that doubled the cost of the order. These details weren't written down anywhere. They existed in Danny's memory, and in the informal network of information sharing that he controlled. Frank knew some of these customer preferences, but he rarely shared them with other drivers. The knowledge was treated as proprietary information that came with seniority and couldn't be transferred to temporary replacements. Tommy spent Danny's 2 days off learning as much as he could about the customer base he was suddenly serving. He wrote down addresses where people tipped well, noted which apartment buildings had security doors that required calling ahead, and memorized the shortcuts between neighborhoods that could save 5 or 10 minutes per delivery. When Danny returned to work on Sunday night, Tommy had accumulated enough information to understand exactly how much money he'd been losing by being assigned to university routes. The confrontation was inevitable, though it didn't happen immediately. Danny returned to find that his regular customers had been well served in his absence, and Frank made a point of telling him that Tommy had done a good job covering the routes. But Danny also noticed that Tommy had been asking questions about customer preferences, delivery timing, and the locations of the biggest tippers. Information that had taken Danny months to accumulate was being rapidly absorbed by someone who had previously been considered a peripheral employee. "Frank says you did good work while I was out," Danny said to Tommy on Sunday evening, as they both prepared for the night shift. "Just tried to take care of your customers," Tommy replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Yeah, well, I appreciate that. These routes can be tricky if you don't know the specific requirements." The word requirements hung in the air between them. Danny was establishing ownership, not just of the routes themselves, but of the knowledge and relationships that made them profitable. Tommy was being politely informed that his temporary access to that information was ending. But something had changed in Tommy during those 2 days. He'd seen how the system actually worked when you were on the inside of it, and he'd earned more money in 48 hours than he typically made in 2 weeks of university deliveries. Going back to competing for scraps while Danny resumed making $60 and $70 a night felt like a punishment for success rather than a return to normal operations. The tension became obvious to everyone at Gino's within a week of Danny's return. Tommy began questioning Frank's route assignments more directly, asking why specific deliveries were going to particular drivers and whether the distribution was based on any consistent criteria. Angela Santos watched these exchanges with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a workplace conflict that management was either unwilling or unable to address effectively. "You need to be careful," she told Tommy during a quiet moment between deliveries. "Frank doesn't like being questioned about how he runs things." "Maybe Frank needs to start explaining how he runs things," Tommy replied, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like favoritism." Angela glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Of course it's favoritism. It's always been favoritism, but complaining about it isn't going to change anything. It's just going to make your situation worse." She was probably right, but Tommy had passed the point where keeping quiet felt like a viable strategy. He'd tasted what equality looked like at Gino's Pizza Palace, and returning to systematic disadvantage felt intolerable. More importantly, he'd begun to suspect that Danny's success wasn't just the result of seniority and Frank's favoritism. It might also involve practices that other drivers weren't aware of. The suspicion started with small discrepancies that Tommy noticed during his 2 days covering Danny's routes. Several customers had mentioned that their usual delivery driver sometimes arrived with extra items that hadn't been ordered. Breadsticks, sodas, or desserts that were allegedly mistakes from the kitchen that Danny offered for free, rather than returning to the restaurant. The customers appreciated the gesture, and it usually resulted in larger tips, but Tommy couldn't figure out how Danny was consistently acquiring these extra items. When he mentioned this to Tony Ritchie, the 19-year-old who'd been working at Gino's for 6 months, Tony's expression suggested he'd noticed similar patterns. "I've seen Danny talking to the kitchen staff when Frank's not around," Tony said quietly. "Really friendly conversations, like they've got some kind of arrangement." The kitchen staff at Gino's consisted of 3 guys who worked rotating shifts: Carlos Mendez, who handled most of the evening preparation, Jimmy Torino, a part-time employee who worked weekends, and Mike Kowalski, Frank's younger brother, who managed the day shift. They were responsible for making the pizzas, preparing side orders, and coordinating with the drivers to ensure deliveries went out promptly and accurately. Tommy began paying closer attention to the interactions between Danny and the kitchen staff. What he observed was a level of communication and cooperation that didn't extend to other drivers. Danny would chat with Carlos about soccer scores and weekend plans. He'd bring Jimmy coffee from the diner next door. He'd ask Mike about his night classes at Cincinnati State and remember details about his girlfriend's job at the department store. These weren't just friendly workplace relationships, they were strategic alliances that provided Danny with advantages other drivers didn't have. When orders ran late, Carlos would prioritize Danny's deliveries to keep him on schedule. When customers called with special requests that weren't on the menu, Jimmy would sometimes accommodate them if Danny was the delivery driver. When there were legitimate mistakes from the kitchen, Mike would offer them to Danny instead of throwing them away or eating them himself. The system created a feedback loop that compounded Danny's advantages. Better relationships with kitchen staff led to better service, which led to happier customers, which led to bigger tips, which gave Danny the financial flexibility to buy coffee for Jimmy and remember Mike's girlfriend's birthday. Meanwhile, drivers like Tommy and Tony operated in isolation, with minimal kitchen support and no access to the informal economy of favors and special treatment. Recognizing the pattern was one thing, disrupting it was something else entirely. Tommy couldn't simply start bringing Carlos coffee and expect immediate results. The relationships Danny had built were based on months of consistent attention and mutual benefit. But he could start paying attention to how the kitchen operated and looking for opportunities to provide value that might be rewarded with cooperation. His first attempt was subtle. On a Wednesday night, when the kitchen was running behind and Frank was in the back office dealing with a supplier complaint, Tommy noticed that Carlos was struggling to keep up with a large order for a fraternity house near campus. Instead of waiting passively for his next assignment, Tommy started folding pizza boxes and organizing delivery bags, tasks that were technically kitchen responsibilities, but that helped speed up overall operations. Carlos noticed the assistance and nodded appreciatively. "Thanks, man, this rush is killing me tonight." "No problem," Tommy replied. "Anything else I can do to help?" The offer was accepted, and Tommy spent 20 minutes helping Carlos organize orders and prepare delivery bags. It was work he wasn't being paid for, but it established a foundation for the kind of relationship he'd observed between Danny and the kitchen staff. More importantly, it gave him insight into how the kitchen actually functioned and where inefficiencies created opportunities for drivers who were willing to help solve problems. Over the following weeks, Tommy continued looking for ways to make himself useful to the kitchen staff. He started arriving 15 minutes early for his shifts to help with dinner preparation. He offered to run errands during slow periods, picking up supplies from the restaurant depot, delivering forgotten items to customers who'd already been served, handling tasks that fell between kitchen and delivery responsibilities. The strategy began producing results within a month. Carlos started giving Tommy advance notice when large orders were being prepared, allowing him to position himself for deliveries that were likely to result in substantial tips. Jimmy began offering Tommy the occasional kitchen mistake, extra breadsticks or a misassembled pizza that could be delivered as a customer service gesture. Mike started sharing information about regular customers' preferences and complaints, knowledge that helped Tommy provide better service. But Tommy's growing integration with the kitchen staff created new tensions with his fellow drivers. Angela Santos noticed that Tommy was suddenly getting better assignments and asked him directly what had changed. Tony Ricci watched Tommy's tip earnings increase week after week and began asking questions about how certain drivers seemed to have access to information that others didn't. More problematically, Danny Morrison began to perceive Tommy's kitchen relationships as a direct challenge to his own position at Gino's. The restaurant was small enough that any shift in alliances was immediately visible, and Danny could see that his exclusive access to kitchen favors was being compromised by Tommy's strategy of making himself indispensable to Carlos, Jimmy, and Mike. The competition escalated in ways that were initially subtle, but gradually became impossible to ignore. Danny started arriving earlier for his shifts, cutting into the time Tommy had been using to help with kitchen preparation. He began bringing small gifts for the kitchen staff, magazines, candy bars, occasionally a six-pack of beer for after-work consumption. He increased his attention to Carlos, Jimmy, and Mike, asking more personal questions and offering more assistance with tasks that weren't related to his job responsibilities. Tommy responded by expanding his own efforts. He started bringing lunch for Carlos on days when the kitchen was particularly busy. He offered to cover part of Jimmy's weekend shifts when Jimmy wanted time off. He helped Mike with his homework during slow periods, using knowledge from his own college courses to explain concepts that Mike was struggling with in his business classes. The kitchen staff found themselves in the middle of an unspoken competition between two drivers who were suddenly intensely interested in their welfare and success. Carlos, who had worked at Gino's for 3 years without receiving much attention from anyone, was now being courted by both Danny and Tommy, with an intensity that felt both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable. Frank Kowalski remained oblivious to the dynamics that were developing under his management. He saw that both Danny and Tommy were working harder and showing more initiative, which he interpreted as positive developments that reflected well on his leadership. He didn't recognize that the increased effort was driven by competition rather than job satisfaction, and he failed to understand that the informal alliances being formed in his kitchen were creating new sources of workplace tension. By the end of April, the competition between Danny and Tommy had reached a level of intensity that was affecting other employees. Angela Santos found herself choosing sides in conversations about route assignments and kitchen policies. Tony Ricci began aligning himself with Tommy, partly out of solidarity with a fellow driver who'd been disadvantaged by the existing system, and partly because he could see that Tommy's approach was producing results that might be replicable. Rick Valdez, who had previously occupied a comfortable middle position in the Gino's hierarchy, found himself being squeezed by the escalating competition. Danny became less willing to share information about customer preferences, while Tommy began treating Rick as a potential rival for kitchen staff attention. The casual cooperation that had previously characterized relationships among the drivers was being replaced by strategic calculation and guarded communication. The breaking point came on a Friday night in early May, when a large catering order for a law firm's partnership celebration created an opportunity for a delivery that would likely result in a tip exceeding $100. Frank assigned the delivery to Danny, consistent with his established pattern of giving high-value orders to his senior driver. But when Danny went to the kitchen to collect the order, he discovered that several pizzas were missing and that Carlos was running nearly an hour behind schedule. Under normal circumstances, Danny would have waited for the order to be completed, accepting the delay as an unavoidable consequence of kitchen inefficiency. But Tommy had been helping Carlos prepare orders all afternoon, and he'd established a level of communication that allowed him to anticipate problems and suggest solutions. When the missing pizzas were discovered, Tommy was the driver who knew which items could be substituted and which customers would accept modifications to their orders. Frank faced a choice: delay the high-value delivery while waiting for Danny's original order to be completed, or transfer the delivery to Tommy, who had the kitchen relationships necessary to expedite a modified order that would satisfy the customer's immediate needs. He chose efficiency over seniority, and Tommy found himself walking out of Gino's with the most lucrative delivery assignment he'd ever received. Danny Morrison stood in the kitchen of Gino's Pizza Palace, watching Tommy load $130 worth of pizza into his delivery bag, and realized that the unspoken rules that had governed his work life for the past 2 years were no longer protecting his position. The Cincinnati Pizza War had entered a new phase, and the next escalation would change everything. The morning after Tommy Castellano walked away with a $112 tip from the law firm delivery, Danny Morrison sat in his Honda Civic outside Gino's Pizza Palace for 20 minutes before his shift started, trying to calculate how much money he'd lost over the past 3 months. The math was uncomfortable. Between Tommy's growing influence with the kitchen staff and Frank's apparent willingness to reward initiative over seniority, Danny estimated he was earning 30 to 40% less than he had been making during the same period the previous year. For someone whose income had supported him through 2 years of night classes at Cincinnati State, the reduction wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to his entire life plan. Danny had been 6 months away from completing his associate degree in business management, with plans to transition out of pizza delivery into office work that would provide steady hours and benefits. The decline in his Gino's earnings meant he'd have to either take on additional debt or extend his graduation timeline, potentially by another full year. But the financial impact was only part of what made the situation intolerable. Danny had built his identity at Gino's around being the reliable, competent driver who could handle any delivery challenge and maintain customer relationships that other employees couldn't replicate. Watching Tommy systematically dismantle that reputation by cultivating his own kitchen alliances and demonstrating superior knowledge of customer needs felt like a personal attack rather than normal workplace competition. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in mid-May, when Danny discovered that Tommy had been tracking customer information in a notebook that he kept in his delivery bag. The notebook contained detailed records of every delivery Tommy had made over the past 2 months: customer names, addresses, order preferences, tip amounts, and notes about family situations, pets, and personal details that could be used to build rapport during future interactions. Danny found the notebook by accident when Tommy left his delivery bag in the break area while helping Carlos with a large order. The bag fell over, spilling its contents across the floor, and Danny was helping to collect the scattered items when he opened what he assumed was a standard order pad. Instead, he found pages of meticulous documentation that revealed the extent of Tommy's strategic approach to customer relationship building. Mrs. Peterson on Ludlow Avenue was listed with her pizza preferences, dietary restrictions, and a note that she'd recently lost her husband and appreciated drivers who took time to chat. The Hendricks family in Mount Adams had detailed notes about their children's ages, school activities, and the fact that they ordered pizza to celebrate good report cards. The law firm had entries for multiple contact people, preferred delivery times, and billing procedures that could expedite future orders. What disturbed Danny most wasn't the existence of the notebook. Customer service was theoretically part of every driver's job responsibilities, but the level of detail and the systematic approach to information gathering. Tommy wasn't just providing good service, he was building a database that could be used to replicate and eventually replace the relationships that Danny had spent years developing through casual interaction and natural rapport. Danny closed the notebook and returned it to Tommy's bag without mentioning the discovery, but the incident crystallized his understanding of what he was facing. This wasn't a temporary challenge from an ambitious co-worker. It was a deliberate campaign to undermine his position at Geno's by copying his methods and improving on them through organization and documentation. Tommy had identified the informal systems that made Danny successful and was systematically replicating them with a level of precision that would be difficult to counter. The realization led Danny to make decisions that would escalate the conflict beyond workplace competition into something approaching sabotage. If Tommy was using information and relationships to build his success, then disrupting those information sources and relationships became a logical defensive strategy. Danny began looking for opportunities to complicate Tommy's growing integration with the kitchen staff and his access to customer preference data. The first incident occurred on a Wednesday night when Tommy had arranged to cover part of Jimmy Torino's weekend shift in exchange for priority treatment on Friday night deliveries. Danny approached Jimmy privately and offered to take the shift himself, explaining that he needed extra hours to pay for textbooks for his summer classes. Jimmy, who didn't want to get involved in what he was beginning to recognize as a conflict between drivers, accepted Danny's offer rather than risk offending either employee. Tommy arrived for work on Wednesday, expecting to have priority status for weekend deliveries, only to discover that Danny had replaced him in the arrangement and that Jimmy was now treating Danny as the driver who deserved preferential treatment. The switch was presented as a simple scheduling change, but Tommy understood it as a deliberate intervention designed to undermine his kitchen relationships. The pattern repeated over the following weeks. When Tommy offered to help Carlos with inventory management, Danny suddenly became interested in learning about food cost control. When Tommy brought lunch for Mike Kowalski, Danny started bringing homemade sandwiches that his girlfriend prepared specifically for the kitchen staff. When Tommy offered to cover shifts for employees who needed time off, Danny began making himself available for overtime hours that previously he'd avoided. The competition created an atmosphere of hypervigilance among the kitchen staff, who found themselves receiving unprecedented attention from drivers who'd previously treated them as support personnel rather than colleagues. Carlos, Jimmy, and Mike were initially pleased by the increased cooperation and assistance, but they gradually began to feel manipulated by the intensity of the attention and the obvious rivalry between Danny and Tommy. Frank Kowalski remained largely unaware of the escalating tensions, interpreting the increased cooperation between drivers and kitchen staff as evidence that his management approach was fostering teamwork and initiative. He failed to recognize that the cooperation was actually competitive maneuvering that was creating stress rather than improving workplace dynamics. His focus remained on delivery times, customer satisfaction scores, and profit margins, metrics that were actually improving as a result of the competition, even as employee morale deteriorated. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of two new drivers in early June. Maria Gonzalez, a 26-year-old single mother who needed evening work to supplement her daytime job as a hotel housekeeper, and David Chen, a college student who was working to save money for his final year at the University of Cincinnati. Both new employees entered a workplace where the established hierarchies and informal systems were being actively contested, making it difficult for them to understand how to succeed or even function effectively. Maria quickly found herself caught between competing advice from Danny and Tommy about which routes to request, how to interact with kitchen staff, and what customer service strategies would produce the best results. The advice wasn't just different, it was contradictory, reflecting the fundamental disagreement between Danny and Tommy about how Geno's should operate and who deserved access to the best opportunities. David faced similar confusion, compounded by the fact that he was younger and less experienced than the other drivers. He made the mistake of asking both Danny and Tommy for guidance on his first night, not realizing that accepting advice from one would be interpreted by the other as choosing sides in an ongoing conflict. By the end of his first week, David had inadvertently aligned himself with Tommy by following Tommy's suggestions about customer service, while Maria had gravitated toward Danny's approach after Tommy's initial advice resulted in poor tips and customer complaints. The division of the new employees into opposing camps accelerated the transformation of Gino's Pizza Palace from a typical service workplace into something resembling factional warfare. Angela Santos and Rick Valdez found themselves under pressure to demonstrate loyalty to one faction or the other, while Tony Ricci became Tommy's most vocal supporter, spreading rumors about Danny's declining performance and questionable customer service practices. The rumors began as minor exaggerations, but quickly escalated into serious allegations. Tony started suggesting that Danny's high tip earnings were the result of systematic overcharging of customers who were too polite to count their change carefully. Danny responded by implying that Tommy was using his notebook to collect personal information about customers that could be used for identity theft or burglary. Both accusations were baseless, but they reflected the level of animosity that had developed between the two factions. Frank's first serious attempt to address the workplace tensions came in late June, when customer complaints about service inconsistency reached a level that threatened Gino's reputation with its regular clientele. Several longtime customers had reported confusion about delivery procedures, conflicting information from different drivers, and a general sense that the restaurant's service standards had declined over the past few months. Frank called a staff meeting for all drivers and kitchen employees, intending to clarify service procedures and re-establish consistent standards for customer interaction. The meeting was held on a Sunday afternoon, when the restaurant was closed in the main dining area that was rarely used for employee gatherings. Frank had prepared notes about delivery protocols, customer service expectations, and the importance of maintaining professional relationships with regular clients. What Frank hadn't anticipated was that the meeting would become a forum for airing grievances that had been building for months. Danny used the opportunity to complain about inconsistent route assignments and preferential treatment for newer employees. Tommy responded by questioning the transparency of tip reporting and suggesting that some drivers were receiving advantages based on personal relationships rather than job performance. Angela tried to mediate by pointing out that everyone was working harder than necessary due to poor communication and unclear expectations. The meeting deteriorated into accusations and counter-accusations that revealed the extent of the factionalization at Gino's. Tony Ricci accused Danny of deliberately providing false information to new drivers to maintain his competitive advantage. Maria Gonzalez suggested that Tommy was creating unnecessary complications by overanalyzing every customer interaction. David Chen, who had been trying to remain neutral, found himself defending Tommy's systematic approach while criticizing Danny's resistance to sharing information with newer employees. Frank realized that he was facing a management crisis that went far beyond service standards or delivery procedures. The workplace he'd been supervising for 3 years had fractured into competing groups that were actively working to undermine each other's success. More troubling was his recognition that he'd contributed to the problem by failing to establish clear policies for route assignments, tip distribution, and advancement opportunities. His immediate response was to implement new rules designed to reduce competition and restore cooperation. Route assignments would be distributed on a rotating basis, ensuring that all drivers had equal access to high-tip neighborhoods. Customer information would be shared through a central log that all employees could access, eliminating the advantage that came from private record-keeping. Kitchen staff would be prohibited from showing favoritism to specific drivers, and any attempts to curry favor through gifts or personal favors would result in disciplinary action. The new policies were announced at a second staff meeting 2 weeks later, and they were immediately unpopular with everyone involved. Danny saw the changes as punishment for his seniority and experience, while Tommy viewed them as Frank's attempt to protect established hierarchies by preventing newer employees from competing effectively. The kitchen staff resented being treated as potential sources of corruption, rather than valuable team members whose judgment could be trusted. More problematically, the new policies were difficult to enforce in practice. Rotating route assignments meant that drivers were often sent to neighborhoods they didn't know well, resulting in longer delivery times and frustrated customers. The central information log was rarely updated and often contained inaccurate or outdated information. The prohibition on favoritism was impossible to monitor without constant supervision that Frank didn't have time to provide. Within a month, the new system had largely collapsed, replaced by informal arrangements that were more secretive and potentially more disruptive than the original competition between Danny and Tommy. Drivers began making private deals with kitchen staff that circumvented Frank's oversight. Customer service suffered as employees focused more on avoiding rule violations than on providing quality service. The workplace atmosphere became characterized by suspicion and careful positioning, rather than the cooperation Frank had hoped to restore. The final escalation began with a seemingly minor incident on a Thursday evening in late July. Tommy had been assigned a delivery to a house party in Clifton that was expected to result in a substantial tip, multiple pizzas, large order value, and a customer who had a reputation for generosity. But when Tommy arrived at the kitchen to collect the order, he discovered that 3 of the 6 pizzas were missing and that Carlos was running nearly an hour behind schedule. Under Frank's new policies, Tommy should have waited for the order to be completed or accepted a reduced tip due to the delay. But Tommy had been tracking this customer for weeks in his notebook, and he knew that the party was scheduled to start at a specific time. Missing the deadline would result in customer dissatisfaction and probably eliminate any chance of a significant tip. Tommy made a decision that violated both Frank's new policies and the informal agreements that had governed kitchen operations for months. He approached Mike Kowalski, Frank's brother, and offered to pay for the missing pizzas out of his own pocket if Mike would prepare them immediately and expedite the entire order. The arrangement would allow Tommy to meet his delivery deadline while ensuring that the customer received their complete order, but it would also give Tommy an unfair advantage over other drivers who couldn't or wouldn't make similar financial commitments. Mike agreed to the arrangement, partly because it solved an immediate problem and partly because he'd developed a personal relationship with Tommy over the previous months. The missing pizzas were prepared within 20 minutes, and Tommy completed the delivery on schedule, earning a $68 tip that represented more than most drivers made in an entire evening. Danny Morrison learned about the arrangement when he overheard Mike telling Jimmy about Tommy's willingness to personally guarantee problematic orders. The revelation confirmed Danny's suspicions that Tommy was gaining advantages through methods that other drivers couldn't replicate, and it provided him with evidence that could be used to challenge Tommy's growing success. But instead of reporting the incident to Frank, Danny decided to respond with an escalation of his own. If Tommy was using personal financial resources to secure better service from the kitchen, Danny would find ways to disrupt that strategy by making it financially unsustainable. He began looking for opportunities to complicate Tommy's orders, increase his costs, and demonstrate that his methods were ultimately self-defeating. The opportunity came the following week, when Tommy had arranged another large delivery that would require kitchen cooperation to meet timing requirements. Danny approached Carlos privately and offered information about a customer complaint that could potentially affect Gino's health department rating. The complaint was legitimate. A family had found a piece of plastic in their pizza 3 weeks earlier, but Danny had kept quiet about it rather than reporting it to Frank or following up with the customer. Danny suggested to Carlos that Tommy's recent practice of personally guaranteeing orders might be creating additional liability for the kitchen staff if quality control procedures were being rushed to accommodate special requests. He didn't explicitly threaten to report the earlier incident, but he implied that Tommy's arrangements with Mike might be drawing unwanted attention to kitchen operations that could result in regulatory problems. Carlos, who was already feeling uncomfortable about the competing pressures from different drivers, decided that the safest approach was to avoid special arrangements with any delivery staff. When Tommy arrived to collect his large order, Carlos informed him that all special requests would need to be approved by Frank and that no modifications to standard procedures would be possible without management authorization. Tommy found himself with a large, time-sensitive delivery and no access to the kitchen cooperation he'd been counting on to ensure customer satisfaction. The order was completed late, The customer was dissatisfied, and Tommy's tip was reduced to less than $20, a fraction of what he would have earned if the delivery had been successful. Standing in the parking lot behind Gino's Pizza Palace on a humid Thursday evening in August, counting $20 bills that represented his lowest earnings in months, Tommy Castellano realized that the workplace competition had evolved into something that could no longer be resolved through hard work, customer service, or even personal financial investment. Danny Morrison had demonstrated that he was willing to sabotage Tommy's success rather than compete with it directly, and Frank Kowalski had proven that he was either unwilling or unable to manage the conflict effectively. Tommy made a decision that would transform the Cincinnati Pizza War from workplace rivalry into something approaching criminal conspiracy. If the system couldn't be beaten through legitimate competition, and if management wouldn't enforce fair policies, then he would create his own system, one that operated outside Frank's authority and beyond Danny's ability to interfere. The next phase of the conflict would involve methods that none of the employees at Gino's Pizza Palace were prepared to anticipate or counter, and it would ultimately result in consequences that no one could have imagined when the rivalry began with something as simple as route assignments and tip distribution. By the end of August 1977, 6 people were working at Gino's Pizza Palace who would not survive the next 4 months. The Cincinnati Pizza War was about to enter its final deadly phase, and the only question that remained was whether anyone would recognize the danger in time to prevent the inevitable tragedy. The first death happened on a Tuesday night in September, though it would be weeks before anyone connected it to the escalating tensions at Gino's Pizza Palace. Carlos Mendez was found in his apartment on Wednesday morning by his landlord, who had come to investigate reports of a gas smell in the building. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty space heater, and the Cincinnati Police Department classified it as an accidental death after a brief investigation that found no evidence of foul play. Tommy Castellano attended the funeral on Friday afternoon, standing in the back of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, while Carlos's family and friends filled the first 10 pews with their grief and confusion. Carlos had been 24 years old, supporting his mother and younger sister while taking night classes to become a certified electrician. His death eliminated not just a co-worker, but one of the few people at Gino's who had tried to remain neutral in the conflict between Tommy and Danny Morrison. The loss of Carlos created an immediate crisis at Gino's that Frank Kowalski was unprepared to handle. Carlos had been the most experienced kitchen worker, responsible for training new employees and managing food preparation during the busiest shifts. His absence left Jimmy Torino and Mike Kowalski struggling to maintain service standards while handling a workload that had been designed for 3 people. More problematically, Carlos's death eliminated the informal mediation that had prevented the competition between Tommy and Danny from escalating into open warfare. Carlos had been the kitchen employee most willing to work with both drivers, providing a buffer that allowed them to coexist despite their fundamental disagreement about how Gino's should operate. Without his moderating influence, interactions between the two factions became increasingly hostile and direct. Tommy's response to Carlos's death was to intensify his efforts to build relationships with the remaining kitchen staff. He volunteered to work additional hours without pay, helping Jimmy and Mike manage the increased workload while learning kitchen procedures that would make him more valuable to future operations. He also began bringing coffee and sandwiches for the entire staff, expanding his strategy of building loyalty through personal attention and small favors. Danny interpreted Tommy's increased presence in the kitchen as an opportunistic attempt to exploit Carlos's death for competitive advantage. He began making pointed comments about drivers who were more interested in kitchen work than customer service, and he questioned whether Tommy's volunteer hours were actually helping or creating additional complications for employees who were trying to maintain professional standards during a difficult period. The tension between the two approaches became obvious to everyone at Gino's, including customers, who noticed that service had become inconsistent and sometimes contentious. Regular customers began asking specific drivers about delivery schedules and restaurant policies, expecting information that employees were increasingly reluctant to share because it might benefit competing factions within the staff. Angela Santos, who had been trying to remain neutral throughout the escalating conflict, found herself forced to choose sides when Frank asked her to train Maria Gonzalez for additional kitchen responsibilities. The training would require Angela to share information about food preparation, inventory management, and customer service procedures that could potentially benefit either Tommy or Danny's faction, depending on how Maria used the knowledge. Angela's decision to align herself with Tommy was based partly on practical considerations. Tommy had demonstrated more initiative and flexibility in adapting to changing circumstances, but it was also influenced by her growing discomfort with Danny's increasingly aggressive tactics. She had witnessed Danny's conversation with Carlos about Tommy's special arrangements, and she suspected that Danny was using intimidation rather than competition to maintain his position at Gino's. The alignment of Angela and Maria with Tommy's faction created a numerical advantage that Danny found increasingly difficult to counter through conventional workplace politics. Tommy now had the support of Tony Ricci, David Chen, Angela Santos, and Maria Gonzalez, a majority of the delivery staff, and enough influence in the kitchen to effectively control food preparation and order management during most shifts. Danny's response was to abandon his previous strategy of building alliances and instead focus on documenting what he believed were policy violations and potentially illegal activities by Tommy's group. He began keeping detailed records of special arrangements between drivers and kitchen staff, instances where orders were modified without customer authorization, and conversations that suggested coordination between employees who were supposedly competing for the same opportunities. The documentation strategy revealed patterns of cooperation that went beyond normal workplace collaboration. Tommy had organized a system where drivers in his faction shared information about high-value customers, coordinated their schedules to ensure optimal coverage of profitable neighborhoods, and pooled resources to provide benefits for kitchen staff that individual drivers couldn't afford. The system was essentially a cooperative enterprise operating within Gino's Pizza Palace, designed to maximize earnings for participating employees while excluding drivers who weren't part of the group. Danny brought his documentation to Frank Kowalski in early October, expecting that evidence of organized policy violations would result in disciplinary action against Tommy and his supporters. Instead, Frank found himself confronted with evidence that his management had been so ineffective that his employees had created their own management structure to replace the systems he'd failed to implement successfully. Frank's review of Danny's documentation revealed that Tommy's faction had developed procedures for customer service, quality control, and conflict resolution that were more comprehensive and effective than anything Frank had established as official restaurant policy. They had created training programs for new employees, standardized approaches to handling difficult customers, and quality assurance procedures that had actually improved service ratings during the period when Frank thought the restaurant was struggling with internal conflicts. The discovery forced Frank to confront the possibility that the competition he'd been trying to suppress was actually producing better results than his own management approach. Tommy's systematic documentation of customer preferences, coordination of delivery schedules, and cultivation of kitchen relationships had improved efficiency and customer satisfaction beyond what Frank had achieved through traditional management methods. But Frank also recognized that allowing an unauthorized management structure to operate within his restaurant created risks that went beyond employee relations. If Tommy's faction was making decisions about customer service, order modifications, and resource allocation without Frank's knowledge or approval, they were essentially operating an independent business that used Gino's facilities and customer base for their own benefit. Frank's attempt to regain control of his restaurant operations led to a confrontation that would determine the final outcome of the Cincinnati Pizza War. He called a mandatory staff meeting for all employees, scheduled for a Sunday afternoon when the restaurant was closed, and announced that he would be implementing new policies designed to clarify management authority and eliminate unauthorized coordination between employees. The meeting was held in the main dining area of Gino's, with Frank standing behind the counter, while 12 employees sat at tables that had been arranged in a semicircle facing him. The arrangement was intended to emphasize Frank's authority and the formal nature of the announcement, but it actually highlighted the division between management and staff that had contributed to the original problems. Frank began by acknowledging that recent months had been difficult for everyone at Geno's, and that he appreciated the initiative and hard work that employees had shown in adapting to challenging circumstances. But he also explained that unauthorized coordination between employees had created potential liability issues and policy violations that could jeopardize the restaurant's operating license and insurance coverage. The new policies Frank announced were designed to eliminate the systems Tommy's faction had developed while reinstating traditional management authority. All customer information would be maintained in a central database controlled by management. Route assignments would be made by Frank personally, based on seniority and performance evaluations that he would conduct monthly. Kitchen staff would be prohibited from showing favoritism to specific drivers, and any attempts to influence food preparation or order management would result in immediate termination. Tommy listened to the announcement with growing recognition that Frank was essentially outlawing everything his faction had done to improve their working conditions and earnings potential. The policies would eliminate the customer service improvements they'd implemented, the coordination that had made them more efficient, and the relationships with kitchen staff that had provided them with advantages over drivers who hadn't invested similar effort in building workplace cooperation. More troubling was Frank's announcement that he would be conducting individual meetings with each employee to discuss their role in recent policy violations and their commitment to following new procedures. The meetings were clearly intended to identify the leaders of Tommy's faction and either bring them back under Frank's authority or eliminate them from Geno's operations entirely. Tommy realized that he was facing a choice between accepting the destruction of everything he'd built over the past 9 months or taking action to protect his faction's interests through methods that Frank couldn't control or counter. The competition that had begun with route assignments and tip distribution had evolved into a fundamental conflict over who had the right to determine how Geno's Pizza Palace operated and who would benefit from decisions about customer service, resource allocation, and employee advancement. The decision Tommy made that Sunday afternoon would set in motion the events that transformed the Cincinnati Pizza War from workplace conflict into criminal conspiracy. He decided that if Frank was going to use his management authority to destroy Tommy's faction, then Frank's management authority would have to be eliminated or circumvented through methods that operated outside the normal boundaries of employment relationships. Tommy's plan was remarkably simple in its conception and devastating in its implementation. If Frank couldn't manage Geno's effectively, and if he was going to prevent employees from managing it themselves, then Tommy would create circumstances that would force Frank to rely on Tommy's faction for the restaurant's continued operation. The plan required eliminating the employees who supported Frank's traditional management approach, demonstrating that Frank's policies were unworkable in practice and positioning Tommy's faction as the only group capable of maintaining Geno's operations. The first phase of the plan was implemented on a Wednesday night in late October, when Danny Morrison was scheduled to make a delivery to an address in Clifton that had been provided by a customer who called during the dinner rush. The address was legitimate: a house near the University of Cincinnati campus where graduate students frequently ordered pizza. But the customer who had called didn't actually live there, and the order had been placed by someone using a false name and untraceable phone number. Danny drove to the address expecting a routine delivery, but instead found a house that was clearly vacant, with no lights on and no signs of recent occupation. He knocked on the door and waited for several minutes before concluding that the order was either a prank or a mistake. He returned to his car to drive back to Geno's and report the problem to Frank, but his Honda Civic had been tampered with while he was investigating the house. The tampering was subtle but effective. Danny's brake lines had been punctured in a way that would cause gradual fluid loss over several miles of driving, creating a situation where his brakes would fail completely as he approached an intersection or stop sign. The location had been chosen specifically for its proximity to the steep hill on Clifton Avenue, where brake failure would likely result in a serious accident. Danny began the drive back to Geno's without realizing that his car had been sabotaged, but he noticed that his brakes felt less responsive than usual as he navigated the residential streets near campus. By the time he reached Clifton Avenue, the brake pedal was going to the floor without producing any stopping power, and he was heading downhill toward the busy intersection at Macmillan Avenue at increasing speed. The crash that followed was devastating, but not immediately fatal. Danny's Honda struck a city bus that was turning left from Macmillan onto Clifton, spinning both vehicles and sending Danny's car into a utility pole that collapsed across the street. Danny survived the initial impact, but was trapped in his car with internal injuries that would prove fatal over the following hours. The Cincinnati Police Department's investigation of the accident focused primarily on the mechanical failure that had caused Danny's brakes to fail, but detectives were unable to determine whether the brake line damage was the result of normal wear, road hazards, or deliberate sabotage. The car was too severely damaged by the collision to preserve clear evidence of tampering, and Danny died before he could provide information about any threats or suspicious incidents he might have noticed. Danny Morrison's death was officially classified as a traffic fatality resulting from mechanical failure, but Tommy Castellano knew that it was actually the first successful implementation of his plan to eliminate opposition to his faction's control of Gino's Pizza Palace. The fake delivery call, the sabotaged brake lines, and the carefully chosen location had been designed to create an accident that would appear random while removing Danny as an obstacle to Tommy's ambitions. Frank Kowalski's response to Danny's death was to suspend all delivery operations for 3 days while he reviewed safety procedures and consulted with insurance representatives about liability issues. The suspension gave Tommy time to consolidate his faction's control over restaurant operations and demonstrate to Frank that normal service couldn't be maintained without their cooperation. When deliveries resumed on Saturday night, Frank discovered that the employees who remained at Gino's were either part of Tommy's faction or too intimidated by recent events to challenge Tommy's emerging leadership. Angela Santos, Maria Gonzalez, Tony Ricci, and David Chen had formed a cohesive group that controlled kitchen operations, customer service, and delivery scheduling through informal coordination that Frank couldn't disrupt without shutting down the restaurant entirely. Frank's attempt to reassert his management authority led to the second phase of Tommy's plan, which targeted the kitchen staff who had supported traditional management structures. Jimmy Torino, who had worked at Gino's for 18 months and had generally supported Frank's policies over Tommy's innovations, began receiving threats that were initially subtle but gradually escalated to direct intimidation. The threats began with anonymous phone calls to Jimmy's apartment, warning him that his cooperation with restaurant management was being monitored by people who had the power to affect his employment and personal safety. The calls were made late at night and used information about Jimmy's daily routines, family members, and financial situation that could only have been obtained through systematic surveillance. When Jimmy reported the calls to Frank, he was told that the restaurant couldn't provide security for employees outside of work hours, and that personal conflicts between staff members were not the company's responsibility. Frank's response reflected his growing recognition that events at Gino's were beyond his ability to control or understand, and that his authority as manager was essentially meaningless in the face of organized opposition from employees who were willing to use methods that went far beyond normal workplace competition. Jimmy's decision to quit his job at Gino's was influenced by an incident that occurred on a Thursday night in mid-November, when he was approached in the parking lot after his shift by 2 men who claimed to represent Tommy's interests. The men didn't make specific threats, but they made it clear that Jimmy's continued employment at Gino's was creating problems for people who had the resources and motivation to make his life difficult in ways that couldn't be traced back to restaurant operations. The conversation was brief and carefully worded to avoid language that could be interpreted as criminal threats, but Jimmy understood that he was being given a choice between resigning from Gino's or facing escalating harassment that might extend to his family and other aspects of his life. He submitted his resignation to Frank the following day, citing personal reasons that prevented him from continuing in food service employment. Jimmy Torino's departure left Mike Kowalski as the only kitchen employee who wasn't part of Tommy's faction, and it eliminated another source of potential resistance to Tommy's control over restaurant operations. Frank found himself managing a business where the majority of his employees were loyal to a subordinate who had demonstrated the ability to eliminate opposition through methods that Frank couldn't counter or even fully comprehend. The final phase of Tommy's plan was implemented in early December, when Mike Kowalski became the target of a campaign designed to force his resignation and complete Tommy's takeover of Gino's operations. The campaign began with systematic sabotage of Mike's work performance, ingredients that went missing during his shifts, equipment that malfunctioned when he was responsible for food preparation, and customer complaints that were filed against orders he had prepared. Mike initially assumed that the problems were the result of increased pressure and reduced staffing following Carlos's death and Jimmy's resignation. But the incidents became too frequent and too specifically targeted to be explained by normal workplace stress or accidental mistakes. Mike began to suspect that his co-workers were deliberately creating problems that would make him appear incompetent and provide justification for his termination. Mike's suspicions were confirmed when he discovered that customer complaints against his work were being generated by fake orders placed by Tommy's faction and delivered to addresses where Confederates would file complaints about food quality, preparation time, or service issues that were supposedly Mike's responsibility. The complaints were carefully documented and presented to Frank as evidence that Mike was unable to maintain the quality standards necessary for restaurant operations. Frank's review of the complaints against Mike revealed a pattern of customer dissatisfaction that seemed to indicate serious problems with food preparation and quality control. But Frank also noticed that the complaints were remarkably similar in their language and focus, suggesting coordination rather than independent customer feedback. The discovery forced Frank to confront the possibility that his employees were generating false evidence to justify personnel decisions that served their own interests rather than the restaurant's legitimate needs. Frank Kowalski's decision to investigate the customer complaints led to his discovery of Tommy's systematic plan to eliminate opposition and control Gino's operations through intimidation, sabotage, and potentially criminal methods. But Frank's investigation also revealed that he was no longer in a position to restore legitimate management authority or protect employees who remained loyal to established policies and procedures. The confrontation between Frank and Tommy took place on a Monday evening in mid-December, after Frank had spent the weekend reviewing documentation, interviewing employees, and consulting with both legal advisors and law enforcement representatives about his options for addressing what he now understood was an organized criminal conspiracy operating within his restaurant. Frank's decision to confront Tommy directly, rather than immediately involving law enforcement, reflected his hope that the situation could still be resolved through normal management channels, and his reluctance to admit that he had lost control of his own business. The confrontation took place in Frank's office after the restaurant had closed, with only Frank and Tommy present to discuss what Frank hoped would be Tommy's resignation and departure from Gino's. Tommy's response to Frank's accusations and demands was to make it clear that Frank no longer had the authority to make personnel decisions at Gino's, and that any attempt to involve outside authorities would result in consequences that Frank was not prepared to handle. Tommy explained that the employees who remained at Gino's were loyal to him rather than to Frank, and that the restaurant's continued operation depended on Tommy's cooperation and leadership. More troubling was Tommy's revelation that he had been documenting Frank's management practices, financial procedures, and regulatory compliance issues for months, and that he possessed evidence of violations that could result in the closure of Gino's and potential criminal charges against Frank personally. The documentation included evidence of health code violations, tax reporting irregularities, and employment practices that violated both state and federal regulations. Frank realized that he was facing a situation where his attempt to regain control of his restaurant had instead exposed him to criminal liability and financial ruin. Tommy had effectively trapped him in a position where he couldn't eliminate the criminal conspiracy without destroying his own business and potentially facing prosecution for regulatory violations that had occurred under his management. The solution Tommy proposed was elegantly simple and completely unacceptable. Frank would continue as the nominal manager of Gino's, handling official responsibilities and serving as the public face of the restaurant, while Tommy's faction would control actual operations, personnel decisions, and profit distribution. Frank would receive a guaranteed salary that would protect him from financial loss, while Tommy's group would receive the majority of the restaurant's profits in exchange for maintaining operations and protecting Frank from regulatory scrutiny. Frank's rejection of Tommy's proposal led to the final escalation of the Cincinnati Pizza War, an event that would eliminate the last obstacles to Tommy's control and establish the framework for what would become known as the Geno's Massacre. Frank's decision to contact the Cincinnati Police Department and report Tommy's criminal conspiracy triggered a response that Tommy had been preparing for since the beginning of his campaign against traditional management authority. The police investigation that began on Tuesday morning, December 20th, 1977, would uncover evidence of a criminal organization that had been operating within Geno's Pizza Palace for over 6 months, responsible for at least 3 deaths and multiple incidents of sabotage, intimidation, and fraud. But the investigation would also reveal that the organization's reach extended beyond Geno's into other restaurants, delivery services, and food industry businesses throughout Cincinnati, creating a network of criminal activity that had been invisible to law enforcement until Frank Kowalski's desperate decision to ask for help. Detective Robert Chen of the Cincinnati Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division received Frank's initial complaint about employee intimidation and workplace sabotage without understanding that he was being introduced to what would become one of the most complex and disturbing criminal cases of his 20-year career. The investigation would ultimately reveal that the Cincinnati Pizza War had been a testing ground for criminal methods that were being replicated across the city's food service industry, creating an underground economy built on intimidation, elimination of competition, and systematic exploitation of regulatory blind spots. The final phase of the investigation began with the discovery of Carlos Mendez's body in his apartment, 7 weeks after his death had been classified as accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Advanced forensic analysis revealed that Carlos had been murdered through deliberate carbon monoxide exposure, using equipment that had been modified to produce fatal concentrations of the gas while maintaining the appearance of accidental equipment failure. The revelation that Carlos had been murdered led to the exhumation and re-examination of Danny Morrison's body, which revealed evidence of poisoning that had been overlooked during the initial autopsy. Danny had been drugged before his fatal car crash, using substances that would have impaired his ability to respond to brake failure, while leaving minimal forensic evidence that could be detected through standard toxicology screening. The discovery of 2 murders led to a comprehensive investigation of all deaths and accidents involving employees or customers of Geno's Pizza Palace over the previous 18 months. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic elimination that had included not just Carlos and Danny, but also 4 other individuals who had posed obstacles to Tommy's organization or possessed information that could have exposed their criminal activities. Jimmy Torino was found dead in his apartment on December 23rd, 3 days after the police investigation began, apparently killed by the same methods that had been used against Carlos Mendez. Mike Kowalski disappeared on December 24th and was never found, though blood evidence in his apartment suggested that he had been murdered and his body disposed of through methods that prevented discovery. Angela Santos and Maria Gonzalez were arrested on December 26th when police raids uncovered evidence of their participation in the murders and conspiracy. Tony Ricci and David Chen were found dead in a storage facility on December 27th, apparently killed by Tommy Castellano, when he realized that the police investigation would eventually expose the full extent of their organization. Tommy Castellano was arrested on December 28, 1977, at a bus station in Louisville, Kentucky, where he was attempting to flee to Florida with over $40,000 in cash that had been stolen from Geno's Pizza Palace and other businesses his organization had infiltrated. His arrest ended the Cincinnati Pizza War, but the investigation of his criminal network would continue for another 2 years and ultimately result in the prosecution of over 30 individuals involved in what prosecutors described as an unprecedented conspiracy that had operated within Cincinnati's food service industry. Frank Kowalski survived the investigation and eventually reopened Geno's Pizza Palace under new management, and with extensive security procedures designed to prevent the infiltration and takeover that had nearly destroyed his business and resulted in the deaths of 6 employees. But the trauma of the Cincinnati Pizza War left him unable to trust employees or maintain the kind of casual workplace relationships that had characterized his previous management approach. The criminal trial of Tommy Castellano began in September 1978 and lasted for 4 months, during which prosecutors presented evidence of a conspiracy that had begun as workplace competition but had evolved into systematic murder, fraud, and intimidation designed to control Cincinnati's delivery food industry. Tommy was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Cincinnati Pizza War officially ended with Tommy's conviction, but its impact on the city's food service industry lasted for years. Restaurants implemented security procedures, background checks, and management oversight systems designed to prevent the kind of employee organization that had nearly succeeded in taking control of legitimate businesses through criminal methods. The case also led to changes in law enforcement procedures for investigating workplace conflicts and employee disputes, as detectives realized that the early signs of Tommy's conspiracy had been visible for months before anyone recognized them as evidence of criminal activity rather than normal workplace tensions. Most importantly, the Cincinnati Pizza War demonstrated how economic pressure, poor management, and institutional indifference could create conditions where workplace competition evolved into criminal conspiracy and where ordinary employees became capable of systematic murder in pursuit of financial advantage and workplace control. The story of what happened at Gino's Pizza Palace in 1977 remains a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of economic inequality, the importance of effective conflict resolution, and the devastating consequences that can result when warning signs of workplace violence are ignored or misunderstood by the people responsible for preventing them.